From the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, An Introduction. Part 2, The Repressive Hypothesis. Chapter 1, The Incitement to Discourse. The 17th century, the 1600s then, was the beginning of an age of repression emblematic of what we call the bourgeois societies, an age which perhaps we still have not completely left behind. Calling sex by its name thereafter became more difficult and more costly, as if in order to gain mastery over it in reality, it had first been necessary to subjugate it at the level of language, control its free circulation in speech, expunge it from the things that were said, and extinguish the words that rendered it too visibly present. And even these prohibitions, it seems, were afraid to name it. Without even having to pronounce the word, modern prudishness was able to ensure that one did not speak of sex, merely through the interplay of prohibitions that referred back to one another. Instances of muteness which, by dint of saying nothing, imposed silence. Censorship. Yet when one looks back over these last 3 centuries, last 300 years, with their continual transformations, things appear in a very different light. Around and apropos of sex, one sees a veritable discursive explosion. We must be clear on this point, however. It is quite possible that there was an expurgation, and a very rigorous one, of the authorized vocabulary. It may indeed be true that a whole rhetoric of allusion and metaphor was codified. Without question, new rules of propriety screened out some words. There was a policing of statements, a control over enunciations as well. Where and when it was not possible to talk about such things became much more strictly defined. In which circumstances, among which speakers, and within which social relationships. Areas were thus established, if not of utter silence, at least of tact and discretion, between parents and children, for instance, or teachers and pupils, or masters and domestic servants. This almost certainly constituted a whole restrictive economy, one that was incorporated into that politics of language and speech, spontaneous on the one hand, concerted on the other, which accompanied the social redistributions of the classical period, the Enlightenment period. At the level of discourses and their domains, however, practically the opposite phenomenon occurred. There was a steady proliferation of discourses concerned with sex, specific discourses, different from one another, both by their form and by their object. A discursive ferment that gathered momentum from the 18th century, the 1700s onward. Here I am thinking not so much of the probable increase in illicit discourses, that is, discourses of infraction that crudely name sex by way of insult or mockery of the new code of decency. The tightening up of the rules of decorum likely did produce, as a counter-effect, a valorization and intensification of indecent speech. But more important was the multiplication of discourses concerning sex in the field of exercise of power itself, an institutional incitement to speak about it, and to do so more and more, a determination on the part of the agencies of power to hear it spoken about, and to cause it to speak through explicit articulation and endlessly accumulated detail. Consider the evolution of the Catholic pastoral and the sacrament of penance after the Council of Trent. Little by little, the nakedness of the questions formulated by the confession manuals of the Middle Ages, and a good number of those still in use in the 17th century, in the 1600s, was veiled. One avoided entering into that degree of detail which some authors, such as Sanchez and Tamburini, had for a long time believed indispensable for the confession to be complete. Description of the respective positions of the partners, the postures assumed, gestures, places touched, caresses, the precise moment of pleasure, an entire painstaking review of the sexual act in its very unfolding. Discretion was advised, with increasing emphasis. The greatest reserve was counseled when dealing with sins against purity. This matter is similar to pitch, for however one might handle it, even to cast it far from oneself, it sticks nonetheless, and always soils. And later, Alfonso de Liguori prescribed starting, and possibly going no further, especially when dealing with children, with questions that were roundabout and vague. But while the language may have been refined, the scope of the confession of the flesh, continually increased. This was partly because the Counter-Reformation busied itself with stepping up the rhythm of the yearly confession in the Catholic countries, and because it tried to impose meticulous rules of self-examination, but above all, because it attributed more and more importance and penance, and perhaps at the expense of some other sins, to all the insinuations of the flesh, thoughts, desires, voluptuous imaginings, delectations, combined movements of the body and the soul. Henceforth all this had to enter in detail into the process of confession and guidance. According to the new pastoral, sex must not be named imprudently, but its aspects, its correlations, and its effects must be pursued down to their slenderest ramifications. A shadow in a daydream, an image too slowly dispelled, a badly exorcised complicity between the body's mechanics and the mind's complacency. Everything had to be told. A twofold evolution tended to make the flesh into the root of all evil, shifting the most important moment of transgression from the act itself to the stirrings, so difficult to perceive and formulate, of desire. For this was an evil that afflicted the whole man, and in the most secret of forms. Examine diligently, therefore, all the faculties of your soul, memory, understanding, and will. Examine with precision all your senses as well. Examine, moreover, all your thoughts, every word you speak, and all your actions. Examine even unto your dreams, to know if, once awakened, you did not give them your consent. And finally, do not think that in so sensitive and perilous a matter as this, there is anything trivial or insignificant. Discourse, therefore, had to trace the meeting line of the body and the soul, following all its meanderings. Beneath the surface of the sins, it would lay bare the unbroken nervure of the flesh. Under the authority of a language that had been carefully expurgated so that it was no longer directly named, sex was taken charge of, tracked down as it were, by a discourse that aimed to allow it no obscurity, no respite. It was here perhaps that the injunction, so peculiar to the West, was laid down for the first time, in the form of a general constraint. I am not talking about the obligation to admit to violations of the laws of sex, as required by traditional penance, but of the nearly infinite task of telling oneself and another, as often as possible, everything that might concern the interplay of innumerable pleasures, sensations, and thoughts which, through the body and the soul, had some affinity with sex. This scheme for transforming sex into discourse had been devised long before in an ascetic and monastic setting. The 17th century, the 1600s, made it a rule for everyone. It would seem in actual fact that it could scarcely have applied to any but a tiny elite. The great majority of the faithful who only went to confession on rare occasions in the course of the year escaped such complex prescriptions. But the important point, no doubt, is that this obligation was decreed, as an ideal at least, for every good Christian. An imperative was established. Not only will you confess to acts contravening the law, you will seek to transform your desire, your every desire, into discourse. Insofar as possible, nothing was meant to elude this dictum, even if the words it employed had to be carefully neutralized. The Christian pastoral prescribed as a fundamental duty the task of passing everything having to do with sex through the endless mill of speech, the forbidding of certain words, the decency of expressions, all the censorings of vocabulary, might well have been only secondary devices compared to that great subjugation, ways of rendering it morally acceptable and technically useful. One could plot a line going straight from the 17th century, the 1600s, pastoral, to what became its projection in literature, scandalous literature at that. Tell everything, the directors would say time and again, not only consummated acts, but sensual touchings, all impure gazes, all obscene remarks, all consenting thoughts. Sade takes up the injunction in words that seem to have been transcribed from the treatises of spiritual direction. Your narrations must be decorated with the most numerous and searching details. The precise way and extent to which we may judge how the passion you describe relates to human manners and man's character is determined by your willingness to disguise no circumstances, and what is more, the least circumstance is apt to have an immense influence upon the procuring of the kind of sensory irritation we expect from your stories. And again, at the end of the 19th century, at the end of the 1800s, the anonymous author of My Secret Life submitted to the same prescription. Outwardly at least, this man was doubtless a kind of traditional libertine, but he conceived the idea of complementing his life, which he had almost totally dedicated to sexual activity, with a scrupulous account of every one of its episodes. He sometimes excuses himself by stressing his concern to educate young people. This man, who had 11 volumes published, in a printing of only a few copies, which were devoted to the least adventures, pleasures, and sensations of his sex. It is best to take him at his word when he lets into his text the voice of a pure imperative. I recount the facts just as they happened, insofar as I am able to recollect them. This is all that I can do. A secret life must not leave out anything. There is nothing to be ashamed of. One can never know too much concerning human nature. The solitary author of My Secret Life often says, in order to justify his describing them, that his strangest practices undoubtedly were shared by thousands of men on the surface of the earth. But the guiding principle for the strangest of these practices, which was the fact of recounting them all, and in detail, from day to day, had been lodged in the heart of modern man for over 2 centuries, for over 200 years. Rather than seeing in this singular man a courageous fugitive from a Victorianism that would have compelled him to silence, I am inclined to think that, in an epoch dominated by highly prolix directives enjoining discretion and modesty, he was the most direct and in a way the most naive representative of a plurisecular injunction to talk about sex. The historical accident would consist rather of the reticences of Victorian Puritanism. At any rate, they were a digression, a refinement, a tactical diversion in the great process of transforming sex into discourse. This nameless Englishman will serve better than his queen as the central figure for a sexuality whose main features were already taking shape with the Christian pastoral. Doubtless, in contrast to the latter, for him it was a matter of augmenting the sensations he experienced with the details of what he said about them. Like Sade, he wrote for his pleasure alone, in the strongest sense of the expression. He carefully mixed the editing and rereading of his text with erotic scenes which those writers' activities repeated, prolonged, and stimulated. But after all, the Christian pastoral also sought to produce specific effects on desire by the mere fact of transforming it, fully and deliberately, into discourse. Effects of mastery and detachment, to be sure, but also an effect of spiritual reconversion, of turning back to God, a physical effect of blissful suffering from feeling in one's body the pangs of temptation and the love that resists it. This is the essential thing, that Western man has been drawn for 3 centuries, 300 years, to the task of telling everything concerning his sex, that since the classical age, the age of enlightenment, there has been a constant optimization and an increasing valorization of the discourse on sex, and that this carefully analytical discourse was meant to yield multiple effects of displacement, intensification, reorientation, and modification of desire itself. Not only were the boundaries of what one could say about sex enlarged, and men compelled to hear it said, but more important, discourse was connected to sex by a complex organization with varying effects, by a deployment that cannot be adequately explained merely by referring it to a law of prohibition. A censorship of sex? There was installed rather an apparatus for producing an ever greater quantity of discourse about sex, capable of functioning and taking effect in its very economy. This technique might have remained tied to the destiny of Christian spirituality if it had not been supported and relayed by other mechanisms. In the first place, by a public interest, not a collective curiosity or sensibility, not a new mentality, but power mechanisms that functioned in such a way that discourse on sex, for reasons that will have to be examined, became essential. Toward the beginning of the 18th century, the 1700s, there emerged a political, economic, and technical incitement to talk about sex, and not so much in the form of a general theory of sexuality as in the form of analysis, stock-taking, classification, and specification of quantitative or causal studies. This need to take sex into account, to pronounce a discourse on sex that would not derive from morality alone, but from rationality as well, was sufficiently new that at first it wondered at itself and sought apologies for its own existence. How could a discourse based on reason speak of that? Rarely have philosophers directed a steady gaze to these objects situated between disgust and ridicule, where one must avoid both hypocrisy and scandal. And nearly a century later, nearly 100 years later, the medical establishment, which one might have expected to be less surprised by what it was about to formulate, still stumbled at the moment of speaking. The darkness that envelops these facts, the shame and disgust they inspire, have always repelled the observer's gaze. For a long time I hesitated to introduce the loathsome picture into this study. What is essential is not in all these scruples, in the moralism they betray, or in the hypocrisy one can suspect them of, but in the recognized necessity of overcoming this hesitation. One had to speak of sex, one had to speak publicly and in a manner that was not determined by the division between licit and illicit, even if the speaker maintained the distinction for himself, which is what these solemn and preliminary declarations were intended to show. One had to speak of it as of a thing to be not simply condemned or tolerated, but managed, inserted into systems of utility, regulated for the greater good of all, made to function according to an optimum. Sex was not something one simply judged, it was a thing one administered. It was in the nature of a public potential, it called for management procedures, it had to be taken charge of by analytical discourses. In the 18th century, in the 1700s, sex became a police matter in the full and strict sense given the term at the time, not the repression of disorder, but an ordered maximization of collective and individual forces. We must consolidate and augment, through the wisdom of its regulations, the internal power of the state, and since this power consists not only in the republic in general, and in each of the members who constitute it, but also in the faculties and talents of those belonging to it, it follows that the police must concern themselves with these means and make them serve the public welfare. And they can only obtain this result through the knowledge they have of these different assets. A policing of sex, that is, not the rigor of a taboo, but the necessity of regulating sex through useful and public discourses. A few examples will suffice. One of the great innovations in the techniques of power in the 18th century and the 1700s was the emergence of population as an economic and political problem, population as wealth, population as manpower or labor capacity, population balance between its own growth and the resources it commanded. Governments perceived that they were not dealing simply with subjects, or even with a people, but with a population, with its specific phenomena and its peculiar variables, birth and death rates, life expectancy, fertility, state of health, frequency of illnesses, patterns of diet and habitation. All these variables were situated at the point where the characteristic movements of life and the specific effects of institutions intersected. States are not populated in accordance with the natural progression of propagation, but by virtue of their industry, their products, and their different institutions. Men multiply like the yields from the ground and in proportion to the advantages and resources they find in their labors. At the heart of this economic and political problem of population was sex. It was necessary to analyze the birth rate, the age of marriage, the legitimate and illegitimate births, the precocity and frequency of sexual relations, the ways of making them fertile or sterile, the effects of unmarried life or of the prohibitions, the impact of contraceptive practices, of those notorious deadly secrets which demographers on the eve of the Revolution knew were already familiar to the inhabitants of the countryside. Of course, it had long been asserted that a country had to be populated if it hoped to be rich and powerful, but this was the first time that a society had affirmed, in a constant way, that its future and its fortune were tied not only to the number and the uprightness of its citizens, to their marriage rules and family organization, but to the manner in which each individual made use of his sex. Things went from ritual lamenting over the unfruitful debauchery of the rich, bachelors, and libertines to a discourse in which the sexual conduct of the population was taken both as an object of analysis and as a target of intervention. There was a progression from the crudely populationist arguments of the mercantilist epoch to the much more subtle and calculated attempts at regulation that tended to favor or discourage, according to the objectives and exigencies of the moment, an increasing birth rate. Through the political economy of population, there was formed a whole grid of observations regarding sex. There emerged the analysis of the modes of sexual conduct, their determinations and their effects, at the boundary line of the biological and the economic domains. There also appeared those systematic campaigns which, going beyond the traditional means, moral and religious exhortations, fiscal measures, tried to transform the sexual conduct of couples into a concerted economic and political behavior. In time, these new measures would become anchorage points for the different varieties of racism of the 19th and 20th centuries, of the 1800s and 1900s. It was essential that the state know what was happening with its citizen sex and the use they made of it, but also that each individual be capable of controlling the use he made of it. Between the state and the individual, sex became an issue, and a public issue no less. A whole web of discourses, special knowledges, analyses, and injunctions settled upon it.